I think a lot of people will be very angry with the idea of a health secretary in the pandemic wanting to frighten the pants off everyone into compliance with some new variant. What's going on?
Yeah, some people comparing it to kind of Project Fear, if you like, today. Clearly, when you read some of the tones of what's in these WhatsApp messages, whether it is Matt Hancock talking about frightening people, or whether it's Simon Case, who's actually still the Cabinet Secretary in this country, the head of the Civil Service, effectively laughing at people who ended up in hotel quarantine. Clearly, it is not a good look. Now, there are lots of things that people say on WhatsApp that, frankly, if they were made public, I'm not entirely sure everyone would feel really quite comfortable with. But at the end of the day, this is the government making rather big decisions that clearly had an impact on every single person up and down this country. And while the intention, I'm sure the actors involved in all of this, the ministers and the civil servants would say, you know, they were still acting in the goods, even if the language involved or some of the messaging on internal WhatsApps was a little coarse. But yes, there will be a lot of people who feel very uncomfortable about this, and it will bleed into that public inquiry about whether the government was making the right decisions based on the right medical advice at the time. I mean, just a perfect example actually has been released this afternoon in those lockdown files, where again the government seems slightly at odds with the medical advice, where the medical advice seemed to be a bit more lax when it came to people seeing partners, people they didn't live with but may have been involved in sexual relationships at the very start of the pandemic. The chief medical officer at the time seemed to suggesting that actually the government really shouldn't be imposing rules that people cannot see each other in those circumstances. In the end, though, the government opted to advise people not to do so. I think in the end, though, Patrick, the big thing about these lockdown files, which I would take away, is, yes, it pulls back the curtain from politics and government, and it often looks quite ugly at the time. However, what I would suggest is that we've not really learned anything significantly new, in the sense that I don't think anyone's been kind of blown away by what's been said in these lockdown files in regards to the actual content. We knew about all the disagreements within government about a whole series of politics, and clearly the arguments about whether lockdowns are right or wrong have persisted for a long time. And the second thing I would also add is, and this is the government's point of view clearly, and Matt Hancock says, these are also selective WhatsApp messages. There are 100,000. Yes. We're clearly not going to see all of them, and so many would suggest that there could be a wider story here at play that we're not quite seeing.
Well, yes, quite possibly, although I can't help but wonder whether or not a particular journalist has a nuclear option that she might be about to press at some point. Darren, another big political story in town today, and I'm just giving a heads up on this to our viewers and our listeners, because potentially any moment we're going to cut away and go live to the House of Commons, where there is supposed to be an urgent question, and that urgent question, Darren, is on one Sue Gray, a lady who was in charge of the old Partygate investigation, who now, it appears, is going to be the Labour Party's Chief of Staff. Questions over the civil service and whether or not they are indeed impartial, and about her links or otherwise to Sir Keir Starmer and the Labour Party while she was in post investigating Boris Johnson and co. What's the latest from Westminster?
Yeah, well, clearly quite a lot of Conservative MPs, enough of them have felt pretty angry about this, to put forward this urgent question in Parliament to try and force Labour to answer some questions on all of this. Now, urgent questions are normally for the government rather than for the opposition, but clearly here, when it comes to this point, it's a much wider point about kind of impartiality within the civil service, and many people that think that Sue Gray has crossed that line by being clearly the most recognisable senior civil servant, but someone who's been at the senior end of civil service for a very long period of time, seemingly going to move to the Labour Party. Now, Keir Starmer was on the radio this morning, unable to answer a pretty basic, clear question about when these discussions with Sue Gray first began, when they approached her to see if they'd take on this job of the Chief of Staff in the Labour Party. He says it was a while ago, clearly doesn't want to get into a timetable. I'm not entirely sure why, if he's got nothing to hide, which he insists he doesn't. But yeah, for the Conservative Party, obviously they're very angry about all of this. They feel that it impinges her lockdown reports. Others would suggest, you know, Boris Johnson didn't simply resign on that evidence alone, but clearly they want questions from Labour, and at the moment, Labour not necessarily terribly willing to answer all of them.